What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Slow Restoration, and we are working on the LLY, and we have a pile of Moog front end parts because we're working on the front end. We're going to completely rebuild the whole front end. I've already got pretty much the driver's side done, so I know what I'm doing as far as how to film it, and we're going to go rapid succession here really quick. I'm only going to film what you absolutely need to know to do this job. Very first step is obviously get up off the ground, get your wheel off. I have my inner wheel well out. You don't absolutely have to do that, but it does make it easier for like upper A arms and stuff like that. So let's get right into it. So technically this is going to cover the 2001 to 2010 2500 HDs. They're all pretty much the same. The 1500s are going to be very similar, but 07 and up 1500s aren't going to have a torsion bar. They're going to have a coilover. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm actually going to turn the wheel here so we can get to the back side here. We're going to go ahead and pop the brake caliper off with the mounting bracket. So it's going to be this bolt here and this bolt right here, right there. We pop that off. There's a 10 millimeter bolt here and one right here that holds this brake line on. And while we're at it, we're just going to go ahead and unplug and unclip our ABS line off our wheel bearing, because that is also going to get replaced. That off, these two off, our line unplugged, and the bolts out of our caliper. We're going to go ahead and pull this caliper off, and I have a bungee strap here. I'm just going to bungee it up in front here. We have plenty of line here now, and we're just going to hang that out of the way because everything's coming off here. So for right now, that's just hanging there. We have it bungeed, secured up there, and like I said, we have plenty of line. These front brake lines are pretty long once you undo them. We're also going to grab the rotor here, and I'll grab both hands here and slip that off. We'll set that down here, and we're going to jump it right into getting this wheel bearing completely off. So there's 4 bolts that actually hold it to the spindle, 15 millimeter, one here, and one on either side of the front. We do have to pop this off first though. We'll get behind this with an edge with a screwdriver, and that will kind of pop right off. That's your dust cap. There's a nut on the end of the axle. We'll pop that off also. We'll take our soft face hammer, a couple hits on the axle to get it popped back through. That's good enough there. Again, 15 millimeter here. With that loose, yours might be a little bit more stubborn, but this one is going to pull right off. And we'll pull that whole bearing and dust shield off, and we'll set that to the side. So we're already looking like we accomplished something, and we kind of did. So we have a bunch of that off. We're going to go ahead and remove this complete spindle because the upper A-arm's getting replaced totally with a Moog part. So it'll be a new ball joint and new bushings. We'll get to that in a second. The bottom A-arm we are going to remove completely because we're doing a new ball joint and new bushings at either end of it. The A-arm itself is fine, so we'll have to remove that and the sway bar end link. But first, let's go ahead and pop this off. So there's a castle nut here with a cotter pin, so we'll straighten that out, pull it out, and go ahead and zip that off. Cotter pin's out, 21 millimeter. Takes it off. And since we're not saving any of this, we're going to take our dead blow. Good hit, pops it right out of there. Now our knuckle is free. We can spin it to get the nut off the top ball joint and the bottom ball joint. Bottom we can use our impact on. The top we'll just put a wrench on there. It shouldn't be all that tight. Take our splitting fork and pop them loose, top and bottom, and we'll pop the upper A-arm completely off. Like I said, we're changing the whole thing, so there's a bolt here, or a nut and bolt here, nut and bolt here. We'll tackle the nuts first, and then it's actually a cam bolt, so I'll show you how that comes apart as soon as I get it broke loose. With the nut popped off, we'll grab a wrench on the front side there, and you can see how that arm goes in and out as you move that. That's obviously how they do their alignment. There's one of these front and back. Once you break that loose, these washers will come off. We'll set all this aside in the order it came off. This pops off, that whole assembly slides out. We'll do that front and back. We're also going to pop this sway bar loose. That was easy. I'm going to go ahead and put a jack, pole jack under this lower A-arm. We pop the nut loose for the shock. We'll pull that out. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull that shock completely out and just get it out of the way for right now. We're going to go ahead and gently let the pressure off this lower A-arm. And we'll get our jack out of there. Now this lower A-arm is completely disconnected except for the bottom bolt and the front bolt, and the torsion bar may be stuck in there, but it will slide out. And with the nut off the back of that bolt and the front bolt, we'll go ahead and gently tap them out. Same with the back here. There was actually a washer on that one, so we'll grab that. Fell in the trash can. Keep an eye on those. Now this front, if you're leaving the axle in, you can get it out. It's easier to remove one of the bolts here, and then this bolt will come right past that axle. It's a little tight, but it does work. So I lied on this side. We just went ahead and pulled the axle to make that bolt easier to get out. And with those bolts out, now we can take and just pry that down out of its spot there. And again, you can see how bad that bushing was. Once you get that down out of its spot, this hex part is where the torsion bar goes in. It might be a little bit stuck, but the torsion bar just slips out of that, or actually this slips off the end of the torsion bar. So next step is obviously to get these old bushings out. So here is the new bushings, and obviously one's longer than the other, and that's self-explanatory. There's the short end, there is the long end. Now you can see how these go in. This one goes in from this side, this one goes in from this side. So keep that in mind as you're putting these in and out, or taking them out and in. And if we hold this up here, that bushing doesn't look long enough, but as you push this in, trust me, this little area will pop right through the end there. But we'll see that in a second. Let's go ahead and get we're gonna use a ball joint press. And here's the other side. Pretty much what you're going to do is push the metal sleeve out of the center of the bushing. You can see it kind of rips and tears. Pushes that right out, and there is no shell on the outside of these bushings, so it's once you get the center out, it's a flimsy piece of rubber, and you can pull that right out. So we'll get it chalked up here, and it's just a matter of, like I said, pushing that bushing out through the center. So this is the way I have it set up here, the ball joint press, pressing on that bushing from this side, and the bushing will fit through the hole on the end of the ball joint press. So it is pretty tight. It'll pop and crack and make all kinds of weird noises as you're pushing it, but let's go for it. And there you have it. As you can see, this one actually completely disintegrated. It was coming out Makes a giant mess, but there's the bushing and what's left of, actually that's the sleeve, and this is what's left of the bushing. And there's the second one out, the longer of the two. Again, came out. Some of the bushings did come out, but these are totally wasted. So we'll go ahead and clean these bores out a little bit. So we went ahead and sprayed this down with some lubricant. Now with this bigger bushing, that distance there is greater than the jaw on my press here. So we're actually gonna take and put that in there and just smack the end of that with a hammer on the sleeve there, and it will start. It'll be a little goofy, might wiggle around on you a little bit, but it will start in there, and we can kind of tap that in far enough that we can get our press started. So there's the setup. Once you get the bushing in far enough, you get this set up. You can actually crank that in slightly just with your hand. Like I said, it goes pretty smoothly. Once that bushing gets a little tension, it'll kind of wiggle as it goes through there. It'll swell up and it'll pop in, it'll swell up and it'll pop in. For right now, we're gonna press it in far enough, and then we're gonna take this little cup on the other end. It actually sits in that. We'll set it in there, and that'll give that bushing a spot to come through the end of that arm there. So if you can imagine it going through like that, it just has a spot for that metal bushing to come through and the rubber to squish out through all the way without bottoming out on our press here. See, it presses in pretty smoothly. Now we're in plenty far enough. We'll back this up and then put that cup on the other side. With that cup there centered up, we'll go ahead and hit it a couple more times, and that should drive that right on through now. Don't want to push that bushing or that sleeve through the bushing like we did taking it out. So I did put this cup here on this side, so it kind of pushes more on the rubber than the steel once you get it far enough in. But you can see I don't have much room there, so you have to have this mostly the way in before you can fit all this contraption together. And there we have the bushing installed. Sometimes you do have to grab this outer lip and kind of work your way around it. You do have to still change that ball joint, but I think I'm gonna hang this on the truck to make that a little bit more manageable. It's kind of a pain when it's flopping around here, and this thing's heavy to handle by itself. So let's hang it back on the truck. Going back together is obviously reverse of taking it apart. We're going to slip it on our torsion bar, just line the hex up in the proper location, and then we'll start lining up our holes in these tabs on the frame. We'll do whatever we need to. You got a push pull jack, so we might have to put a pull jack on the torsion bar here, but just get those lined up, get your bolts pushed back through. Remember, both of them go back through. With that lined up, both bolts started, the nuts on them. We're not going to tighten that up at this time. As you can see, we're going to have to lift that. So we're going to go ahead and tackle this ball joint real quick, and that'll just be a matter of chucking up this assembly in our ball joint press, pressing the old one out. And you do have to index the new one. Obviously they didn't grease this because it was full of road grime, but there's a notch here. I'll show you as we're putting it back together, but pretty much there's a notch here in the lower arm, and that's where you want your ball joint to be indexed so you can get your grease fitting on there. Got the ball joint press chucked up here, rigged up, so we're pressing on the top. The ball joint comes obviously down through the arm here, and then this sleeve is bigger than the ball joint itself, so it'll go down through. And the stud is actually sticking through the bottom of the tool here, or starting to stick to the bottom of the tool here. So let's go ahead and get some pressure on it. Hopefully that'll pop off fairly easy. Ball joint's out. We'll clean that bore up. We'll take our hollow cup here and put on the top. That'll allow that dome of that ball joint to stick up through. and then this sleeve with the correct adapter will fit on the bottom, so we can push this back up through. Right there is, you can see it right there, the grease fitting hole. If we move this cup to the side, right there is that notch. So when we start this, definitely make sure you line that grease fitting and that notch in the arm, and then we can just go ahead and press that home. And just like that, we have a new ball joint in the bottom too. New bushings, new ball joint. We'll go ahead and screw our grease fitting in there before we put any of this stuff back together, but we can go ahead and loosely snug these bolts up. We could do that before, but whatever. We'll loosely snug them up, and we'll get a jack under this and get this kind of in position and start getting some of our stuff. We can actually go ahead and hang the axle right now. We can put the knuckle back on and the upper A-arm. We do still have to reach up inside there and do the, let's do that first. We're gonna go inside and do the idler arm. So there's two pieces to that, and we'll get that popped off of this arm, and we'll also pop loose the inner tie rod end. So pop the inner tie rod end off. Normally you would take the outer off and use a tie rod socket, inner tie rod socket, but we're not saving any of this like I was saying before. So I'm just going to take a big pipe wrench here, and we'll go in from the front side here, put it on there. I already broke this loose, but as you can see, that just spins right off. So we'll spin that out, get rid of this whole assembly here, and that'll make room so we can go in and get that idler arm. And got that off. That's what it looks like when it's out. There's actually no grease fitting in this. It's actually in the center link. You can see right there, center link's hollow. This has a hole in the center of it, and that's how it greases it. So you grease through there and it feeds it right into the end of this. But this one hasn't been greased in quite some time and is completely wore out. So that whole assembly's off. We'll replace that in a minute. But now we're going to go ahead and take this center link off of the idler arm. So we're going to pop this nut loose and pop that joint loose, and then we'll actually have to take this front cover off, and there's two bolts that hold the bracket, the idler arm mounting bracket to the frame. But let's get this popped loose and that shield down. We'll grab our light so we can see what we're doing. And right there, that bolt and that bolt hold that bracket on for the idler arm. And this, unfortunately, because it's on top of that shield, rarely gets greased. So there is a grease fitting right there, and then there's also one on top of that one, that joint there where it goes to the center link. And they rarely get greased just because people miss them. But as we see, I'll show you, Moog actually kind of solved that problem. They give you a hose that relocates that, so you don't have to reach up behind that shield and or take that shield down to grease that and service it. So we'll get into that in a second, but for right now, let's go ahead and pop these two bolts out and get that whole idler arm and bracket out of the truck. And I didn't show it, but I did have to remove the steering stabilizer shock, and the whole center link slides right out of the truck. So here's where the idler arm goes on, there's where the steering stabilizer goes on, and this is where your Pitman arm goes on, and obviously each end is the inner and outer tie rods. With those two bolts, we should be able to get this, grab this, and kind of wiggle it right out of its bracket there. We'll pull it out this way. So there is the two pieces. So let's grab the Moog and compare it. So there's the stock, there's the Moog. The stock is actually, that piece is aluminum. The Moog is actually cast iron for the upper piece. The both lower pieces are cast iron, but obviously that slips on there. And they give you all the mounting hardware and cotter pins and stuff like that. And here is that grease hose I was talking to you about. So pretty much you take this out this grease fitting out, screw this adapter in that they give you, screw the end of the hose in, and this reroutes that. It's got an eyelet on the bottom, and that bolts to your front sway bar mount, and then you have a grease fitting at the end. So you grease the upper all the way down here, makes servicing it a little bit easier. Assembled, that's how you're roughly going to look. Grease hose coming off the bracket. So we'll go ahead and throw this up on the truck. Got that all bolted up, the line looped around. Like I said, goes right to the front sway bar bushing, so it's a lot easier to grease that upper joint there. And while we're here, we did do, and they're also Moog parts, so they were already done. Very easy to do. You just take the 2 bolts out, take your old one off, and put the new one on, put the clamp back on. With that idler arm on there now, it's all good except for connecting the center link, and that's what it does. It just kind of pivots in there like that. We're gonna go over and tackle this Pitman arm. Let me grab my light on our way over. So the bad part about the Pitman arm is, as you can see right there it is, but it's right below this cross member, and this cross member is welded into the frame. So we do have to loosen the steering box up to gain access to that. It's three bolts, 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna try for right now to leave the steering shaft on, see if we can get enough movement like that. I'm not quite sure yet though. So let me get that popped off, and if we can pivot this around and I can get an impact on the nut at the bottom, and then get my Pitman arm puller on there and get that slid off, we'll be in good shape. If not, we'll have to go a little further up top there and take that steering shaft off. All right, I did get that to come off. We had to remove the sway bar again and just kind of prop up out of the way. Unfortunately, I have the wrong Pitman arm. These come either 3 flats around it. They're splined, but they have flats, so it's either 3 flats around it or 4 flats around it. This box is actually a 3 flat box, and my Pitman arm is a 4, so I'll have to get another one. So we're gonna jump back over here and continue putting stuff together. We got the axle back in there, 6 bolts tightened back up. We're gonna go ahead and take our spindle, drop it on, kind of position it over the axle here, and attach our lower ball joint and get this jacked up, and then we'll put our upper A-arm on. That's kind of the way that looks. Axle's fed through there. And moving right along here, we got the upper A-arm on, upper ball joint tight, and the cotter pin in, the bolts with the cam washers in and snugged up. I just used the old marks as reference. This will have to go and obviously get a complete front end alignment when all this is complete, but for now we'll go off with the old settings and get it fairly close. So we're gonna go ahead and throw the wheel bearing on, and we can actually get the rotor, caliper, all that stuff on there, and then we'll just be waiting for that Pitman arm to put the rest of the steering components together. Get our rotor on, brake caliper on, everything tightened up. We'll go ahead and tighten up. There's 10 millimeter there, 10 millimeter there. Make sure I got that slipped off. So that's all good, and because we have our wheel bearing on now, we can actually go ahead and clip some of this stuff into place. This goes around and clips in that hole, and the rest of this stuff kind of goes right around, and just the way you took it off. And then don't forget to plug that end of the ABS sensor in. We're actually looking good now. We're pretty much back together. Like I said, we just need to finish up this steering, and I can start on some of it. I'll put my center link together, my inner and outer tie rods, maybe slip that through there, but as soon as we get that, hopefully that Pitman arm comes in really soon, we can get that done. But this is a long process. This is not for your beginning guy that's wrenching. This is pretty involved. You need some specialized tools, but some basic knowledge and some equipment, you can get this done. We did get our correct Pitman arm, and as you can see, we have it installed. The box is reinstalled. 3 bolts, tighten it back up. Definitely make sure you get enough torque. I think the torque spec's 184 foot-pounds, but you do want to draw that Pitman arm up and try and match the spot where on the splines where it was before. And a little trick here, a normal Pitman arm puller won't fit over this sleeve, but this sleeve does push up. So it's a rubber sleeve. If I grab it, it does work back down. Let me pull it back down and I'll show you what it looks like. Right now you can see the splines, and then once you're done, you can kind of grab that rubber dust shield, pull it back down, and that will cover those splines back up. But this gets covered, as you can see, with road debris and grime. So it looks like that's the metal part of the shaft, and it's not. It's a piece of rubber that does slide up out of the way, and then a normal Pitman arm puller will fit over that, so you can get that pulled off. But we do have the correct, on this particular one, a three flat spline reinstalled. Now we're ready to go, I guess, back with that. And I do have the inner and outer tie rods put together. I'll show you that real quick before we go any further. And here's the inner and outer tie rod assembled. As you can see, we have the old one set right beside it, and that's so we can get the basic length set up. We line that up. Come over here, we want the overall length to be really close to the same. Might have to run these in a little bit further to match that up, but it's fairly close. And I start with around 25 complete turns, rotations, to thread this on, and then you just have your lock nut here, and that'll get you close enough to get to alignment shop. Like I said, with all this new stuff, even if we put the exact number of turns back on, there's almost a 0% chance it's going to be dead on. So we're just going to get close so we can get the front end alignment done on this. Another quick comparison here. So this is the stock inner tie rod, and it's pretty small. Obviously this is the weak point of the Chevy IFS, and yes, I know Moog is not top of the line, top notch, but they are stronger than the stock. If you can see on the stock, the threads and the bar right off the threads is pretty much same size as the threads up until it gets here, and then it does neck up a little bit. Off the Moog one, you have the threads, it's got a hex that goes up and then it immediately goes up to a good bit bigger. Might be hard to see that on the camera, but these are bigger diameter than the stock, which means you have to be careful when you get tie rod sleeves. They do make sleeves that kind of slip on. They have a threaded end. It can replace your jam nut here, and it threads on, but it also covers most of this, which kind of reinforces this. But because the Moog piece is a larger diameter, most of your aftermarket tie rod sleeves won't fit. So with their whole center link out of the vehicle, we'll actually thread this inner tie rod on there. And like I said, be careful because you do have a grease fitting there, and that's what feeds this inner tie rod. You don't want to snap that off, so be gentle with it. But you can take a wrench at this point because this is out of the vehicle. It's more accessible. You can take a wrench and snug this up. It does have, we grab our other one here, it does have a thread locking compound already applied to it, and you want to tighten that up. Make sure this bottoms out against there. Snug that up good. If not, you can do this on the vehicle and use an inner tie rod socket, but you're not going to be able to have your outer tie rod on, in which case not a big deal. Once you get this kind of set, you can loosen your jam nut slightly, leave the jam nut there, spin your outer tie rod back off with the jam nut, or you can count the turns and remember that, or you can leave your jam nut there and just have that as your mark to reassemble. And like I said, we're just getting close so we can get to alignment. Before we slip this assembly back in, I am going to go ahead and reinstall my sway bar here, just to kind of get it up out of the way, because this notch here, or this bend here, is where the this assembly, your tie rod will come through, and right now if I put it in, we'll be on the wrong side of it, and that'll be a mess. So it needs to go back up anyway. We'll go ahead and get this done, and then we'll fish this through. Sway bars on, tightened up. We have the tie rod assembly slid in place, and for right now we're just going to turn both of the hubs or spindles out to give us room clearance, and we'll go ahead and get our Pitman arm and idler arm started through the hole here on the taper and get the nut started, and then we'll line everything up and tighten it all up at once. With that in there and all tightened up, don't forget you do have cotter pins on the Pitman and idler arm. We can go ahead and line the spindle up with the outer tie rod. Slip that up in there, and we'll start our castle nut on the top here. Spin that down, go ahead and torque that down, and again it does have a cotter pin that goes through. Line the holes up, slip it through, no big deal. Don't forget to install your grease fitting, your grease zerk at the bottom, and then we'll start. We're pretty much done at this point, and one very important step left to go though. Actually, let me back up. There's actually two really important things you need to do. The very first one is go ahead and grease everything. So these come with assembly lube grease in them, but they're not greased ready to run. And a lot of people make that mistake. They see as they're assembling this stuff, there's already grease in it. You can see by this boot here, it's collapsed, it's floppy, it needs to have grease in it. So grease everything. And when you do an oil change, or even before, go ahead and top these off, recheck them. Every piece we put on here, with the exception of the wheel bearing, has a grease fitting, so everything gets greased. And the second thing you need to do, or I highly recommend doing, is just putting a wrench and or ratchet on everything. Just make sure you got everything tight, you didn't miss anything. A lot of the stuff we put on loosely and then came back to, so just make sure you didn't miss anything. There's a lot that's been done here, from pretty much the wheel bearing all the way in on both sides. So there's a lot there, a lot to potentially miss. So just go over it and make sure everything's nice and tight. The only thing I remembered as I was going, yes, we're doing an oil change also, but we do have to drop it down and torque the wheel bearings. That's the final thing I need to do. We'll get the wheels back on, I'll get that done, and get some oil put back in, and we'll take this thing for a test drive.